In the 1970s, before powerful synths became part of the palette of rock music, there was an amazing sound that dominated the charts. It was a powerful, distorted drone that became forever associated with glam rock, and it was made on an electric guitar. But for various reasons, of which more later, it became lost to history. It's a forgotten technique, but I think it deserves a place in modern music. So I'm going to show you exactly how to make it and how to use it in completely different ways. In this video, I'm going to reveal the secret of how to make the amazing Glam Drone sound. So that is exactly the sound. It's a lost effect that most people don't know how to make, but it's quite easy once you've mastered only 3 tricks. This is the technique I'd encourage you to use. You don't need any expensive equipment, and it's so cool and flexible that it can breathe new life into your productions. So a few days ago, I got this question in the comments from someone with the handle @ElectroInBlack6852. He writes, there was a particular droning guitar sound that T-Rex, the Glitter Band, and the Suite had that seemed to disappear. I would like to know how they did it. Well, I've actually been intrigued by that very sound since 1986. And I remember the year because Susie and the Banshees had just released their 7th album called Tinderbox with a new guitarist, John Valentine Carruthers. As usual, I set about learning how to make all of the guitar parts. Some of them were easy, but some of the sounds seemed really hard to get right. I just couldn't figure out how Carruthers was doing them. And in 1986, there wasn't any internet to help with research, but there were guitar magazines. And I remember reading a long, extended interview with Carruthers where he went into great detail about how he made the more unusual noises, the guitars he used, his effects, and so on. And one of those sounds, he said, was inspired by what I call the Glam Drone, but which he referred to as the glitter sound. Because although the Glam Drone is a very cool sound, it's unfortunately associated with one of rock's most notorious villains. The sound was made popular, maybe even invented, by a guitarist called Gerry Shephard from the Glitter Band, which was of course fronted by Gary Glitter. His crimes are as notorious as they are unforgivable. But Gary Glitter didn't invent Gerry's Glam Drone sound, and he wasn't even the producer or arranger. That was Mike Leander, and it would have been Mike who had the golden ears and would have listened to the drone and said, "That's a hit, keep playing it like that." Well, the Glitter Band on its own, even without Gary Glitter's vocals, had a very distinctive sound with double drummers and Gerry's amazing Glam Drone guitar sound. And a great way of hearing the Glitter Band sound is an instrumental called Rock and Roll Part 2. So I'm using, as you can see, one of my custom shop guitars, which has been very expensively relicked with sharp objects to give it a lovely homemade look. The guitar sound is routed first through my pedal board of guitar effects, which hasn't changed in over a decade, and then into a normal guitar amplifier with a bit of reverb added to make it sound a bit more like the record. And for anyone who wants to sort of play the game along, I'll let you guess which effects I'm using and in what order, and then I'll tell you in a couple of minutes after I've played it what the actual effects chain is. So that is exactly the sound. Right, So what stack of effects am I using to produce that insane sound? My pedal board is pretty much the opposite of my synth collection and contains a lot of very high quality, expensive, boutique and vintage effects, including a compressor, a flanger, an octave divider, a chorus, and a vibrato pedal. Any ideas? You get 1 point if you guess the number of effects, 2 points if you guess the number and the type, 3 points if you guess the number, the type and the order, and 4 points if you guess the number, type, order and the specific name of the effect pedals. Here's a clue. Remember that Gerry Shephard made this sound in 1972. Decided? Let's have a look. Yeah, that's the secret. My pedal board was in bypass. I wasn't using any effects at all. Not a single one. Full marks to anyone who guessed correctly. So how on earth is that sound made? So first, as many of you will have noticed, I'm playing with this thing called a slide on my left hand. More on that later. Second, the way I'm picking the strings using this plectrum on my right hand is very specific. This is an optional extra, and again, I'll cover that in more detail later. But the third thing is easily the most important, and I got it from that John Valentine Carruthers Guitar Magazine interview from 1986, although it would be years later before I fully understood exactly what he was talking about. Let me explain, for anyone watching who doesn't know, just a little bit about how guitars are tuned. A standard guitar has 6 strings, which are tuned so that the lowest one, which is the thickest, is E2, almost 2 octaves below middle C on a piano, right up to the highest, E4, a couple of octaves higher. The middle strings are usually tuned more or less in equal intervals, which means that it's straightforward to play scales and a whole range of chords. This is the tuning played by most guitarists, regardless of genre. But that's not the only way to tune a guitar. And Gerry used an alternate tuning to get his Glam Drone sound. What was it? Well, again, going back to the John Valentine Carruthers interview, I remember he said something like, and I remember this even though it was almost 40 years ago, it was something like, the Glitter Band used to tune the guitar strings so they were all at the same note. That's how they got that yell sound. That's right. Every string tuned to the note A. Okay, they're not all the same octave. So really it's A1, A2 and A2, and then 3 lots of A3. But even so, Gerry's guitar was entirely in unison with itself, which gave rise to a few interesting effects. So Gerry's guitar sounded a bit like a vintage mono synth, but with 6 oscillators, playing the same note spread over different octaves. The tuning drifts slightly, and you get this lovely thick sound, which sounds a bit like a chorus effect. Well, I don't have a 6 oscillator mono synth. I'm not even sure that one exists. But I've got some mono synths that I can chain together, so let's see what that sounds like. I'll use sawtooths, and let's start by bringing in the first oscillator from the Model D. Now the second oscillator, tune it up, and you can already hear the chorusing. And the third, tune it up. Now I'll do the middle octaves from the Pro 1. There we are, let's tune it. And the second oscillator. And now I'll use the neutron for the bass string. Right, it's a little loud. that is a fantastic sound, but it's not the sound that Gerry used. Because unlike a mono synth like that, every time Gerry played a note, he could select which group of strings to play. And finally, he used this thing called a slide or bottleneck. Usually, a guitar string changes pitch by being pressed down against frets, which then make it effectively shorter, and that rises the pitch. But with a slide, the string is made shorter from the top of the string, which means that you can then slide up and down frictionlessly like this. Now, there's nothing special about slides. Slides are just cheap tubes made out of metal or glass. This one's made out of metal. And they're sometimes called bottlenecks because they originate from people using the neck of bottles. Incidentally, if you'll forgive me for digressing just a moment, you might hear some people referring to this Glam Drone tuning as ostrich tuning, which is similar. It's a unison D tuning, and it's named after the Lou Reed Ostrich song. I think of Gerry Shephard's tuning as being different, not just because it was tuned to A instead of D, but much more importantly, it's got a different combination of octaves. You know, not that it really matters. Okay, now look, before I get back to playing, let me show you the correct way of playing the slide, at least for this sound. Theoretically, you can have the slide on any of your 4 left-hand fingers, and each choice has its own pros and cons. I do it the same way that Gerry did most of the time, which is to put the slide on my middle finger, which is also the longest, and brace it with my index and ring fingers. As well as this meaning that the slide is kept very stable, which is important for slide playing, I can also fret additional strings with my little finger while I'm playing slide. And I can also use my first and my third to play if I lift the slide out of the way. So it's very flexible. This is the technique I'd encourage you to use, and it's the one Gerry played most of the time. Ignore the other people on the internet. Playing effective slide doesn't take long to master, and you can do interesting techniques with vibrato. And you can get diaphragm-like effects. And you'll also find that in this tuning, you can exaggerate the detuning effect just by changing the angle of the slide like this. So this sounds very different too. Does it matter what slide you use? No. Gerry used a glass slide. I'm using a brass slide today. Whenever I can't find my slides, I've been known to record with makeshift objects like, I don't know, an Allen key. You're not going to hear the difference on a record, although some of them might be more comfortable than an Allen key. So when I play in this tuning, I normally think about there being sort of typically 4 types of sound I'm going for. So the first is the straightforward unison sound, and I really want to hear the D tune but with only 1 octave. And to really exaggerate the D tune, you can do what I'm doing there, which is angle the slide. The second sound is unison but with a middle octave. So I've got 2 unison strings on the top and then a middle octave. Okay. The third sound is the low sound, which is the bottom string and the octave above it. So, okay. And then the final sound is the fully open. Okay, and you can put those together in very interesting ways. So, for example, this sounds very different too. Sounds a little different too. So you hear that the only difference there is effectively the string gauges. This is that middle sound, but played an octave above that. So it's worth trying to figure out how to get these textures. And then you'll find that this crazy sound is applicable to all sorts of different genres. So I've already said that similar unison tunings have been used in very different ways by bands like Velvet Underground, Soundgarden. These are all unison tunings that I'm talking about. And those songs sound very different. But there are even more ways of using it because, as I said earlier, it's a little bit like a mono synth with detuned oscillators. So what if we used it in that way? Back in 1980, Human League released an EP called Holiday 80, which I would now be holding up if my copy hadn't gone missing. The most famous track on the EP is Human League's own song, Being Boiled, which has stood the test of time as a classic of the era. But actually, the first track listed is a cover of Glitter's Rock and Roll with Gerry Shephard's seminal Glam Drone part played on huge mono synths. So I thought, what if I turned that around and played the more famous song from that Human League EP, Being Boiled, using Gerry's Glam Drone on a guitar? And what if I threw in some extra guitar effects just for good measure? So here is my interpretation of Human League's Being Boiled, played with a single live guitar in Gerry Shephard's Glam Drone tuning, with a dream pop intro, just to showcase the range of sounds you can get. If you liked this video and you want to hear more stories about how sounds were made on records from the 70s and 80s and see those being applied with modern music productions and real music, please like and subscribe. But first, I want to say a few words about an ethical dilemma, whether we can or should separate the music from the musician. How do we reconcile the enjoyment of a song with the often deeply flawed, even criminal nature of the person who created it? Now, the main subject of the video you've just seen is a sound made famous by Gary Glitter, even though he didn't directly create it himself. Gary Glitter's crimes are horrific and unforgivable. Is it ever okay to appreciate his records? What about songs produced by Phil Spector, who was a convicted murderer? Or Smith's records in the light of Morris's views on race and immigration? What about Michael Jackson, whose musical genius is overshadowed by serious allegations, though never legally confirmed? Well, here is where I think I stand on all of this, and the first thing to say is that I don't think every case is the same. Unless you're directly affected as a victim, I believe that it can be sometimes possible to separate the art from the artist. Phil Spector was a loathsome human being, but I don't think his personal actions diminish the quality of the records he produced for, say, the Ronettes or the Righteous Brothers. Similarly with Michael Jackson, even if one fully believes the worst allegations against him, his music stands apart from those actions. In these cases, the artistry doesn't, for me, overlap the music in a way that would make it a problem for me to listen to Thriller or Off the Wall. Now, Morrissey presents a different challenge because as a lyricist, his views are more directly embedded in his music. I remember the first time I read the lyrics to his early solo song Bengali in Platforms, where he sings, "Shelve your Western plans, life is hard enough when you belong here." That's not a sentiment I share and not a song I want to listen to. But I still enjoy Smith's records, where he's largely singing about subjects like alienation and unrequited love. But Gary Glitter is a special case. Because with him, it feels like the art and the crime are deeply intertwined. His glam rock persona, his flashy clothes, and his lyrics seem to have all been part of a larger, sinister agenda. When I hear him sing lines like, "Do you want to touch me there? Yeah," it's pretty hard for me not to hear them in the context of his predatory behaviour. But maybe the music, which was pretty much produced and arranged by other people, shouldn't be cancelled. The Glitter Band musicians, like Gerry Shephard, suffered professionally due to Glitter's actions, and without the shadow of his crimes, they might have had more successful careers. Well, as I said, I think every case is different, but when the lines between the artist's behaviour and their music are blurred, as with Gary Glitter, I find it difficult to separate the two, and I find Glitter's songs, particularly his lyrics, tainted by his actions, which complicates my ability to listen to them. But that Glam Drone, I think that's a great lost sound. So let's rescue it and put it into new contexts. Thanks for watching. See you next time.